Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome. It's really lovely to have you here. I'm Eve Duffy, Associate Vice Provost for Global Affairs and Interim Director for the Duke Middle East Study Center, or DUMESC, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to this event. This talk has been organized by the Asian Pacific Studies Institute, APSI, and DUMESC with support from the Asian and Middle Eastern Studies Department, Cultural Anthropology, and the Josiah Trent Memorial Foundation Endowment Fund. That's a very long way of saying we have a lot of widespread support for this event. This event teases next week's International Education Week, which will be a week-long series of events emphasizing that global education is for all here at Duke and elsewhere. Peter Hessler will be introduced this evening by Professor Prasenjit Dwara. Dwara is the Oscar Tang Chair of East Asian Studies at Duke and Faculty Director of APSI. He was born and educated in India and received his PhD in Chinese history from Harvard. Professor Dwara started his early work on rural society in early 20th century China, but has turned to studies of nationalism, imperialism, the origins of modern historical consciousness, and indigenous and religious views on environmental sustainability. He is one of the most original thinkers on culture and religion in Asia. So said Ian Johnson. Please join me in welcoming our guest, Peter Hessler and Professor Dwara.
Well, Eve, that is going to get me into trouble with a lot of my professional colleagues. So, but thank you for introducing me, Eve. But before I begin my formal introduction to our honored speaker, Peter Hessler, I want to say once again that this is a cross-regional, cross-area collaborative efforts spearheaded by APSI and the Middle East Studies Center. And we, as many of you already know, we have a fairly prominent global and area studies program at Duke. And they are not only intra-area studies, so just East Asia or just Middle East or just South Asia, but also cross-area. And the Global Asia Initiative has been doing a lot of the cross-areal work. But this wonderful event was planned and made possible by two staff members, right? They are thanks to, so the thanks go first to Griffin Orlando, and back there, and Alex Nickley of APSI, who many of you know, who together wrote an important proposal to the Trent Memorial Foundation Endowment for a grant, and got it. And this has now been made possible by that. We also want to thank Heidi Rockefeller and Renate Kwan for their tireless logistical work and helping make all this possible. Now, to come to Peter Hessler, my head has been in the academic cloud for a long time. So I actually did not know very much about this very honored speaker and well awarded with a MacArthur and the Kiriyama Prize and so on, until when Alex mentioned that he was going to try and bring him over. But then around that time too, I began to subscribe to the New Yorker. After about 3 or 4 years of their sort of hammering me with their everyday magazine, I finally yielded. And then I began to read his stuff, right? And so I started reading these essays, including two that I want to mention that are clearly my favorite. I've read a few, not so many, but the ones that I like the most are Learning to Speak Lingerie, which is like language, Chinese Merchants and the Inroads of Globalization, which appeared, I think, in the New Yorker at least in the New Yorker, maybe elsewhere too, in 2015. The second is a more recent one, the double education of my twin Chinese school. My twins Chinese school. He has twins. So in the Chengdu Primary Experimental School, and this was, of course, during COVID, right, that you were writing about. It's a fascinating piece that goes back and forth between his ancestors in the U.S. and a Chinese visitor there, and his children in the school, and how that works. These are among the most delightful, perceptive, as well as serious and informative, all at the same time. And so it's a very rare combination, and I'm beginning to try to get my head out of the academic cloud a little more to read people like him, and maybe we will become more readable in the process. But I shouldn't take more time because we can't cut into his time. So let me just read out some parts that you may have already read. Since 2000, Peter Hessler has been a staff writer at The New Yorker. He first went to live in China's Sichuan province as a Peace Corps volunteer from 1996 to 1998, an experience that became the subject of his first book, A River Town. With Hessler's next two books, Oracle Bones and Country Driving, he completed a trilogy of reported works that spanned a decade in China. In 2011, he moved with his family to Cairo, where he lived for 5 years. His fifth book, The Buried, described his experiences during the Egyptian Arab Spring. So, and then in 2019, Hessler returned to China, where he taught for 2 years at Sichuan University. He also covered the pandemic for The New Yorker, operating from Wuhan and other cities. This experience is the subject of his newest book, which is called Other Rivers, which will be published in the summer of 2024. So look out for it. Hessler currently lives in southwestern Colorado with his wife, the writer Leslie T. Chang, and their twin daughters. I've been instructed to mention what else is happening with Peter Hessler, to remind the guests that the acclaimed China hand, Kaiser Kuo, who's sitting right here in front, who's also a former rock star in China, will be doing a Sinica Live taping with Peter Hessler tomorrow afternoon at 3 p.m. at the National Museum, at the National Auditorium. You all know where the National Museum is. I guess the auditorium is in there. That event is also free and open to the public. In addition to these engagements, Peter will also be giving a closed writing workshop for a diverse cohort of students from both Duke and UNC. We would like to thank him for that as well. And in terms of tonight's program, Peter will talk for about 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A session, 30 minutes. So thank you all, and thank, of course, Peter Hessler, and thank all of you for coming.
Yeah, thanks so much. And it's a great pleasure to be here tonight and to visit Duke. I don't think I've been on campus before. I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about some of the research I did that involved both China and the Middle East. Obviously, this is a difficult and dispiriting time to talk about the Middle East, and I sympathize with the frustrations and the sense of helplessness that's felt by many who are following the current events. So I moved to Egypt in October of 2011, which was a little more than half a year after the fall of Hosni Mubarak, and it was during a pretty promising moment in the Arab Spring. Some of the big events that I wrote about that fall were the parliamentary elections, which represented Egypt's first truly democratic elections, and the following year I covered the first democratic presidential race, which was won by Mohammed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood. So that was sort of my first introduction to Egypt as a foreign correspondent. But then the year after the election was filled with violence, political strife on all sides between Islamists, between people who supported the military, between the youth who had sort of inspired the revolution in the first place. And on August, in June of the following year, actually early July, Morsi was deposed in a military coup and was removed from office. And then on August 14th of 2013, the Egyptian security forces massacred around 1,000 people in Cairo, something that's known as the Rabaa massacre, named after a mosque where supporters of Morsi had gathered. So the trajectory that I witnessed as a foreign correspondent was really sobering, from the promise of the first elections to the violence and the repression of the post-coup period. And when you see, when you witness these kind of events, and when you follow the current events in Israel and Palestine, you're intensely aware of the weight of history, of the various legacies of colonialism in the Middle East, and the ways in which hatreds and resentments have become deeply entrenched. In retrospect, it's probably not an accident somehow that it was during this period, during this very difficult post-coup period, that I also started to research Chinese activity in Egypt. As I'll explain, this project began by chance, but once it started, I appreciated the way in which it contrasted with everything else I had been covering for the past 2 years. China is outside of our usual narratives about the Middle East. It has no colonial history in the region, and generally it's been known for dealing with both Israel and Palestine. And most of the Chinese that I spent time with in Egypt had arrived there with very few preconceived notions about their new home. And so in a way, as a writer, it was easier to focus on the human side of cultural and economic exchange. And that's going to be my main focus tonight. But I also want to talk a little bit about the role and the routines of a foreign correspondent. And I'll start with a basic question. How should a foreign correspondent come up with ideas for stories? A simple question, but one that's hard to give an easy answer to. In a way, I was thinking about this long before I actually became a journalist and became a foreign correspondent. I started, my career in China began as a Peace Corps volunteer. I was sent there in 1996. I was teaching in a small place called Fuling on the Yangtze River, teaching English. And I taught literature, but also my colleague from the Peace Corps and I, we also taught classes about English and British culture. And we were given a textbook. In those days, you had very little access to outside materials. We had no internet access. And the book that we were given was a government-published book called Survey of Britain and America, which gave background about America and Britain. And we taught mostly about America. And it had all kinds of interesting historical background. Like I remember one sentence in the book said, "The Constitution of 1787 established the dictatorship of the American bourgeoisie," which is still going strong. And then they had sections about the economy. Like I remember there was another sentence that I quoted that in the book, one of my favorites said, "Most New Englanders, therefore, are working in factories today. They are good at making watches and clocks." So there was a lot of this sort of information, but there was also a section on social problems in America. And one of these, and one part of this chapter was about campus life, life on American campuses. And there was this incredible litany of crimes that had been committed on American campuses. So on this place in South Carolina at a small college, a student was raped. And at this college in Connecticut, a student was assaulted. And it was, on and on about this. And at the time, it was frustrating because, in a way, I couldn't tell my students that these were lies. I think these were probably real events. These were probably things that had happened. But they had been sort of lifted from newspaper stories and taken out of context and sort of given to this audience that didn't really, at that time, especially in the 90s, didn't have a lot of background about the United States. And I would notice similar things in conversations. Like I remember one of my students saying, I heard that the Washington NBA team changed their name from the Bullets because of gun violence, which was true. And it's, that is an important thing, but it's probably not the first thing you should know about the United States. And this was a student who had very little other background. So I became, as a teacher, I was very aware of how frustrating it was when things were taken out of context. And so once I began writing, I moved to Beijing after the Peace Corps and became a foreign correspondent, and I thought a lot about this issue. And part of it is simply the traditions of journalism in America is that you try to expose local problems and bring them to light. And like those articles, those stories about the campus assaults and so on, those would have been very important in their community for people to know about them. But people in those communities already had the context. They knew what average campus life was like. But the Chinese students who were reading this did not. And I could see the same thing happening the other way. Often stories were reported in China about sort of extreme problems or extreme situations and transported to an American audience that didn't have the necessary context. And in a way, it just kind of disorients and confuses people. So I was aware of that and wanted to do something different, wanted to write in a way that gave context. I was lucky to write for The New Yorker, which gives you more space, which always helps in terms of giving context. But I also realized that in some ways, the answer to this question to me often had more to do with methodology. Not so much the type of topics that I was going to choose, but how you live your life, how you do your research, your daily routines. Those things really do affect the kind of subjects that catch your attention, the kind of subjects you pursue. So I was very attentive to this. And when I moved to Egypt, I tried to follow these rules. Like, over a period of about a decade in China, I developed kind of some, not exactly rules, but sort of principles of how to proceed as a correspondent. And I think one of the first ones was to learn the language as well as you can, try to develop the abilities and tools necessary to research independently and alone. The last part was actually important, in that I always found that it was necessary to be by myself. And so not only was it important to try to speak the language as well as possible, but even something like getting a driver's license so that I wouldn't need to hire a driver. One thing I learned as a foreigner in both places is the more people that are with you, it changes the interactions. So if you arrive in a place with a driver and a fixer and a translator, you become, this is sort of like your entourage. And your status as a foreigner is also playing into that. And you may intimidate people, they may speak with you differently. So actually, as a correspondent, I even tried not to work with photographers, in the sense that if the New Yorker sent a photographer to work with me, I usually did all of my reporting first and then gave the context to the photographer. Because even having one other person is a distraction. It's also a distraction to you. Some of your focus is inevitably going to go to the other person. My wife, Leslie Cheng, is a writer, and people sometimes ask, do you guys ever research stories together? And we would both be appalled by the concept of that for the same reason. Like I don't want to be talking with her or focusing on her. And just having somebody else there is going to take some of the focus away. I also always tried to get outside of the capital and the major cities, everywhere I lived, and tried to be open to spontaneous encounters. As you plan interviews and other research, don't overschedule. This was also connected to the first one. If I'm alone and independent, it's easier to control my schedule. I don't have to negotiate with people and say, oh, we're going to do something different. But those kind of spontaneous encounters I found were very important, almost as a type of survey, in the sense that you're trying to respond to what you encounter, not just what you expect to encounter. And tonight I'm going to talk about one of these instances. So as I mentioned, in 2013, after the coup and the subsequent massacre, most of those events were focused in Cairo in the north. But there were sort of echoes that happened in the southern part of Egypt, which is called Upper Egypt. There were periodic protests and spasms of violence. And one of the most significant was in a pretty remote, undeveloped place called Malawi. It's known for being pretty conservative, mostly Muslim community, very undeveloped and usually not visited by foreigners. And after the massacre in Cairo happened, there was a series of protests there, and some of these demonstrations became violent, and mobs of people attacked and burned a local Coptic Christian church, a government building, and the local museum. And 8 people died during this. I had spent some time there before because, as I said, I always tried to establish patterns outside of the capital. So I'd visited this place, and after I read about that, I decided that I wanted to go down there and talk to people about what had happened. So a few months after these events, I went down there. By this point, I'd been in Egypt for a couple of years. My Arabic was not fluent, but I could hold good conversations and I could get good information. And I had bought a car and was driving myself, which also made it easier, of course, to do this kind of work. So I drove down to the museum there that had been attacked. So even though this place was quite remote, it's near some very prominent archaeological sites. So they actually had some quite good artifacts at this local museum. And when I got there, you could still see the effects of the attack. The gate had been broken. There had been an arch across the entrance that had been destroyed. The door was still wide open. Actually, the man who worked as a ticket taker was one of the fatalities, one of the people who were killed trying to defend the museum. When I went inside, there was nobody immediate in the entrance. I walked into the main exhibition chamber, and that was a scene. It had been full of artifacts, and every single thing had been taken out. This museum had 1,089 artifacts, and 1,043 had been stolen. And when I went upstairs, they had you could see the display cases that had been broken and everything looted. So I spoke with the curator there and talked with him for a while. And he told me about the day of the attacks and things that had happened. And then I went back to my car, and I parked across the street from the museum was this kind of market that in Arabic, or in Egyptian Arabic is called a marid, like just an open air market. And there was a burned out car parked there that had been bombed with a Molotov cocktail during the violence. And so when I was going back, there was like a group of guys started talking to me, and I started having a conversation. This was of course, a familiar scene to anybody who's reported in Egypt or China. As a foreigner, you attract attention. In China, I got used to talking to groups of 10 or more people, especially in the 90s, and they always ask the same questions. The first one would be, what country are you from? Or in Sichuan, they'd say, 你是哪国人? And the second question was usually, what's your salary? Which took some while to get used to, but in China we sort of liked it, because you could ask people about money too. It wasn't something that made people uncomfortable. One of the first things as I began to speak Egyptian Arabic was to notice the difference in the questions in these situations. The first question was still the same: what country are you from? Where are you from? But the second question was often, into Muslim? Are you Muslim? Or Dinek? What religion are you? But this was never asked in any kind of confrontational way, or nobody, it was just making conversation. It was really similar to the money question in China, in that this was just an important part of local culture, and people were just curious, and so it was something that you wanted to learn to talk about. Leslie would always say that she was Christian even though she wasn't, partly because Buddhism is buzi, or buzia, which is sats, and the people would always laugh if you said that you were Buddhist. And she's not really Buddhist either, but anyway, you pretty much had to be either Christian or Muslim. But in Egypt, of course, the conversations, one of the big differences was also it never went to money. And I learned that pretty early, and I wasn't really prepared for that. I had this idea of Middle Eastern culture and the souk and the marketplace and all these things. I remember when I got there early on, I was bargaining with somebody on the street for a bottle of water, and I was just kind of getting warmed up. Like if you're in the Peace Corps in the 1990s, you become a real pro bargainer. Like that's a big part of routine. And I was talking to this guy in Cairo, and we were just getting started, and he got so frustrated that he went, La ilaha illallah, which means there is no God but God. It's like the opening prayer of the Quran, and it's because he was trying to control his temper. He was frustrated with me already. And I was like, oh God, I bargained this guy to the point of prayer. And I learned that this was not something you wanted to talk about in Egypt. People didn't want to talk about money. Religion was good, money was not. There was sort of a concept of the evil eye and bringing bad fortune on yourself if you speak about something like this. And so you had to be very careful when asking those kind of questions. But anyway, I was talking with these guys, and we were chatting, and I started asking them, well, so what happened in the museum and in the car? And they said, oh, that wasn't people from Malawi. People from Malawi didn't do it. It was outsiders. It was foreign agents. And I said, well, where are they from? It's like the money was from Qatar and from the United States. They were the ones who did this. Locals wouldn't do this. And actually earlier in this trip, I had talked with the governor of the province. It's not a province, they call him governorates in Egypt. Again, a totally different sort of research routine. In China, I never, interviewed, I guess what you would call a shengzhang, like the governor of a province. And you could request those interviews, but they're not going to talk to you, just like the shuji's not going to. But in Egypt, I learned the same thing. You couldn't request an interview, but you could actually just go to the office and sit outside the guy's door. And there's like a line of people. And you can go and see, is the line long today? And if not, then go ahead and take your chance. Because it's not very systematic, and a lot of it depends on these kind of spontaneous encounters. And so I did that when I was in this governorate, and after a few of these guys got their turn, I got mine. And he was he was not been scheduled to speak with a New Yorker correspondent that day, but he was perfectly happy to do it. His name was Salah Ziada. He was very dynamic, and like a lot of Egyptians, loved to talk. And I said, well, what was the source of all this violence? And he said, it was the Americans. He said, this was an American plot to turn Egypt into a new Syria, new Libya, new Iraq. And I said, well, who in America in particular? He said, it was Obama. He said, ask Obama's spokesman about everything he said. And this was also sort of classically Egyptian. People love to talk, and this is the kind of thing that nobody in China would ever say if you go into a government office, like to immediately start on the conspiracy theories. And the whole time I was writing, at one point he's like, you're not really going to publish this, are you? And I was like, yeah, no, I'm planning to publish this. He's like, I bet you won't publish. I was like, no, I definitely will publish this. Please, please keep talking. But he was just completely unafraid. I mean, one of the lovable things in Egypt is how talkative people are and good humored. So this was sort of this conspiracy theories had become really common after the massacre and after this period of political strife. And that this was the scene when we were talking out in front of the Mara. During this conversation, some guy in this group says, there's a Chinese guy in the market. And I wasn't sure I heard him right, because in Arabic, Chinese sounds a lot like Sinai. And so I said, what? Can you repeat that? And he said, there's a Chinese guy here. And they didn't know I had anything to do with China. I had mentioned China. I'm a foreigner, and there's no foreigners in Malawi, and there's another foreigner, this Chinese dude in the Malawi. So I was like, really? I was like, can you take me to this guy? I said, yeah, sure. So they come back, and then we went through this like little warren of shops, and I go to the back, and sure enough, there's this small guy called Yeda, who was sitting there in a little shop in the middle of this market in a very remote part of Egypt, of Upper Egypt, and he was selling these sort of dresses. Now these are dresses that in Egypt, a woman would never wear this in public, especially in this part of the country. People wear very heavy clothes. They cover their heads. But when they're at home, they can wear this, as long as there's no other men around. Because, of course, it's very hot, and these are more functional clothes. But he was selling these sort of things. But then he also had an enormous selection of lingerie. And, some of it not what you would expect to see in Malawi, much less being sold by a Chinese guy. So I was just sort of like flabbergasted, like, what are you doing here? How is this happening? He was just sitting there. So we talked for a long time. And of course, after about an hour, I'm thinking, the guys out there were talking about the foreign agents who set fire to the museum in the box. And then the foreigner showed up alone in the car and spoke Arabic with them. And then they took him to the Chinese guy. And now he's speaking Chinese with a Chinese guy. So how long is it going to take for the police to come? And after an hour, the police station was like 2 blocks away. No police. And I came back several times, and the police never talked to me in that place. So this I often thought about conspiracy theories during this time and the ways in which they were expressions of helplessness. And in a way, it was something that was almost designed for inaction, because these theories seemed to be more appealing if the targets were distant and abstract. They really didn't want to connect me to the conspiracy. They didn't want me to be the foreign agent. We're talking in a friendly way. There's a tradition of hospitality. It would be very awkward if I was in fact a foreign agent. And let's keep that with Obama and his spokesman. And let's deal with this guy here. So after that, I started going back, and I visited Yeda again. The next time I was there, I called him, and I met his wife was there with him. And he went to get meat for lunch. He actually bought camel meat by mistake, and we ended up having noodles with no meat as a result. And they were living in really tough conditions. They were sort of vaguely aware of the violence that had happened there, but they weren't really totally aware. They had moved in after it. I went to their apartment. They had lawn furniture that they were, using for their daily life. And they had one book in the apartment, which was not an Egyptian Arabic dictionary. The only book that they had was this book, which has the subtitle is 你是自己最好的医生, you are your own best doctor. So it's like a self-help medical guide. So these people were really out there. And talking to him, like, how did you get here? He said, well, my cousin, Ye Haijun, he's in Minya. And Minya was the next city downriver. So after talking with Yeda, I went to Minya and met his cousin, who was working in another shop, selling the same kind of stuff. And pretty soon I learned that I could go into a city and just sort of ask where the Chinese were. In Asyut, which is a pretty big city, about 400,000 people, I parked my car and I called the cabbie and I said, can you take me to the Chinese? And he said, sure. And then, and he took me to this shop, Noma China, and dropped me off there. And then across the street, there was another one called China Star. And so I did this. I kind of investigated like about a 250-mile stretch of the Nile. And these were the places where I found Chinese lingerie dealers. There were 2 of them in Beni Suef up in the north, 6 of them in Minya, 2 in Malawi, 12 in Asyut, 4 in Sohag. I went to Nega Hammadi, and the people were like, oh, you just missed the Chinese. They went home for vacation. But they still had a sign. The sign said, Il Mara del Cini, which is the Chinese market. And the subtitle was Family Accessories for the Bride and the Groom's Trousseau. So you could see all these marks about the Chinese there. While I was doing this, I was also focusing on the products, which had some of the brand names included Laugh Girl, Shady Tex Lingerie, Hot Love Italy Design. Again, these were not highly practical garments. But I did notice that there was also a series of them that were marketed under the brands China Hangzhou, Zhongguo Hangzhou, and Zhongguo Hangzhou Shihu. So like after they had these like very Westlake oriented things. And so I called the number on there, and sure enough, a guy answered. He said, oh, I'm in Cairo, come talk to me. And he was a guy who manufactured these things. And he told me his name was Dong, and he had more than 40 relatives doing this around Egypt, selling his products. And after that, I started to meet Dongs everywhere. And they were selling. So I was kind of tracking this, trying to figure out what's going on here. It was a mystery to me, like how had this gotten started and how did it work? Why is this happening? Of course, the Chinese doing business abroad, wasn't something that when I lived in Fuling was very common. Although actually my first year that I was there, Jiang Zemin gave a speech telling Chinese firms to go out. That was the words he used. And that was the first time a Chinese leader had said that. And that was sort of a signal to go overseas. And by the time I was in Egypt, there were more than 1 million Chinese in Africa. A lot of this activity had been state-directed. There had been a huge number of loans by China's Export-Import Bank, and there were a lot of state-owned factories, but there were state-owned companies that were active in Africa, especially with trying to extract resources. But there were also a lot of independent entrepreneurs, and these were the people that I was looking at. Nobody had told these guys to go to Egypt. And I was curious about this, and pretty much every African capital now has a Chinese business association, and there was one of them in Cairo, the Aiji Huaran Shangwu Zhongxin. So I went and visited that and met the Huizhang, or the president, who gave me his name card. This is sort of, I think, one of the tragedies of the WeChat, the Weixin, is that you no longer get name cards like this. Because when I lived in China, I always knew that there's nothing better than getting a name card with at least a dozen titles. Like, you're going to have a good interview like that. And the name card culture was such a, like, we loved it in the Peace Corps, actually. When I was in Fuling, my colleague Adam and me had business cards made up when we were there, mostly because you could get a motorcycle on them, right, which was a great thing. And of course we put our names, Huawei, Meiji, and we said we were Jingli, which is managers, and it was the Fuling Zizhiqu, which is the Fuling Autonomous Region. And this has really confused people. They would say, well, Fuling Bushi Zizhiqu, this is not an autonomous region. and I'd be like, of course it is. There's a motorcycle on the name card. You have to believe it. But anyway, so I got to Chen Jiannan, and who was president of the Egypt-China Friendship Council, president of the Egypt-China Peaceful Reunification with Taiwan Association, president of the Czech Trustworthy International Trade Company, overseas advisor of the Zhejiang Province Overseas Exchange Society, all these positions. And this guy was a character. He was talking, very talkative. He actually spoke good Arabic. One of the very few Chinese I met who did. And he was having his daughter educated in Arabic. And actually, at one point early in our interview, he said, "Into Muslim?" which was that question. Are you Muslim? And I said, "La," and no. And he said, "Alhamdulillah," which means all praise be to God. And then he opened a drawer and pulled out 2 big beers. And so I was drinking the beer with the president of the Egypt-China Peaceful Reunification with Taiwan Association. And then eventually I have to go to the bathroom, and so I go into the bathroom, and while I'm standing at the toilet, I look over. And so then And so then I went back in. I was like, there's a big turtle in your bathtub. He's like, oh yeah, that's from the Red Sea. Like, you're supposed to be in the restaurant downstairs, but they lost their power, and like, there's this whole reason for it. So he was, this was, and I asked him, how did you come? He's like, well, he originally worked in a restaurant in Prague, and he took a vacation to Egypt in 1998. He thought, I think there's some opportunities here. The first thing he started selling was lingerie. But by the time I interviewed him, he also had a shoe factory, a factory that made PVC window frames, and another factory assembling solar panels. And at one point during this conversation, he said something that I always remembered. I asked him, how did you figure out that these things were in demand? And he said, somebody who does business just sees things differently. It's like a hunter. A hunter goes out into the wild, and he'll spot a rabbit or a deer or some other animal. He knows what he's looking for. It's the same for a businessman. He sees whatever is in demand. I asked him where he was from, and he said, Wenzhou. And that was something that almost every lingerie dealer that I met was from there. All of them were from Zhejiang, but most of them were from Wenzhou. Wenzhou was an area I'd visited a lot from 2005, 2008. Because I had a former student who was there, and I spent a lot of time. And I used to love flying in there because at the airport they had this bookstore with a whole shelf of books about Wenzhou business. And some of the titles so that's where Wenzhou is, down there in the south of Shanghai. So when you went into the airport and you saw the books, one of them was called Kepada Wenzhou Ren, the feared Wenzhou people. There was the collected secrets of success of Wenzhou people, the Wenzhou Code, deciphering the culture of the business kingdom, and the Jews. My favorite one was Dongfang Youtairan, the Jews of the East, the commercial stories of 50 Wenzhou business people. And I would see people sometimes. One of the guys I was interviewing in Wenzhou at this time, where I actually saw him reading the book about the Jews of the East, and because they like to read these books themselves. And he asked me if he said, "Oh, you're from America. Do you know any Jews in America?" And I was like, "Yeah, I write for the New Yorker." And he said, "Are the Jewish people are they good at doing business?" And I said, well, I guess some, but Jewish people do all kinds of things in America. He said, well, it says here the Jews in Europe are famous for doing business. I said, I guess traditionally there was that reputation. He said, and this book also says that the Jews are the Wenzhou people of Europe, which took me a little while to wrap my head around that. But I used to love visiting, and people in Wenzhou were famous for the niche economy. They would find these niches and exploit them. So there was a town that made plastic drinking straws. There was a town that made scales. There was a town that made umbrellas. Probably my favorite one I used to drive through was called Qiaotou, which is pretty close to Wenzhou, kind of on the outskirts. And when you drove through, they had this market with this big statue, which is, I think, the only statue of a button in the world, because that was what people in Qiaotou made, was buttons. And you went into the mall, and all they sold was buttons. They had 380 factories that made buttons, and it was 70% of the Chinese market. So they were famous for this. The other thing that was interesting was that they had done this without any government investment or direction, really. It wasn't like Shenzhen that had received special status and rules. And the educational system was pretty weak. While I was doing research there was a government statistic that said 80% of the entrepreneurs in Wenzhou had an education of 8 years or less. Most of the books, like the Dongfang Youtairan, they were sort of geographical determinism, which was probably somewhat accurate, which is that this was a place that had pretty bad connections by land because it's surrounded by mountains, so people turned to the sea, and they developed trade networks all over the world eventually. And so they had this tradition, and even after the communist period ended, they were able to quickly kind of resuscitate these contexts and to move back into traditions. They had a reputation for being fearless and flexible, and they valued business, so they really cared about it. And so, as I began to meet the people who were doing lingerie in Egypt, one of the first guys who had done this was a guy named Lin Qianfei. It was in the town of Asyut. Like many of the Wenzhou people, he wasn't very educated. He had a 5th grade education. He'd grown up on a farm. He did trade in Beijing for a while at Yabaolu, a place that some people of my era would remember. After the 1999 financial crisis in Asia, he was looking around for opportunities, and he'd heard some people from his village had gone to Egypt, and he decided he wanted to go there. And the way he decided to go to Asyut was he just looked at a map, and he said, I don't want to go to Cairo, that's where everybody's going to go. I'll find the biggest city in the south, and he chose Asyut. It actually was the 2nd biggest. He wasn't right about that. And he said he brought 3 things in his luggage. pearls, neckties, and lingerie. And I said, well, why'd you do that? And he said, because they're small. You could fit a lot of them in the luggage. And the pearls were useless. Nobody wanted pearls. Neckties, even worse. You can't wear a necktie with a galabea. But the lingerie sold. And so we went back and got more and eventually started shipping it in. And so, it was interesting how he had found his way there was actually by trying to get away from other Chinese people. I think when I wrote about this, when I mapped this out, I said it was like mapping the territory of large predator cats. And because they were usually separated by intervals of about 50 or 60 miles. And they were in clusters dependent on the size of the place. And a lot of them had stories. Like one guy had previously sold construction materials in Azerbaijan. He said, it was good for a while, but then too many other Chinese people showed up, so I left. Another guy had been selling winter coats in Siberia. He said, yeah, then the Chinese people came. And so, in a way, it wasn't colonial in the Western sense. They weren't spreading an idea. They weren't there to make these places Chinese. And actually, in a lot of ways, they were trying to get away from other Chinese people. And that was part of why they ended up in these remote places, because of competition. And they tended to be quite outspoken, actually, in their criticism of China and Chinese society, Chinese politics. Lin was there with his family. His wife was named Chen Taimei, and his daughter was Chen Yayun, who was, she went by the English name Kiki, and her husband was Liu Jun. And so they worked, they managed the shop there. I spent a lot, I got to know them quite well and spent a lot of time at their shop and, began to understand better why this market, existed for them. I mean, again, it was largely because of what women have to wear in Egypt. They kind of need an outdoor set of clothes and an indoor set of clothes. But then there was also this huge market for lingerie. One of the Chinese dealers, when I asked him why, he said, if you never have a chance to look nice in public, it's hard on you psychologically. And they have to wear so many clothes when they're outside, so they like to have these things to look prettier at home. But the main reason was the marriage tradition. When Egyptians marry, the groom buys an apartment and the furniture, and the arusa, the bride, is responsible for acquiring small appliances, kitchenware, and clothing, including lingerie. It's a really important part of the process, and this is called the gehez, kind of the dowry. And so a lot of their business was focused on brides and people that were preparing to get married. And there was one day when I was hanging out in the shop there, and a young woman came with her mother and her fiancé and her brother. And immediately Kiki knew what was going on. And she said, Arusa, 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 bride, bride. And that's what she addressed her as, the bride. And then, this was a Muslim family. They were quite conservative. The woman's headscarf was done kind of a conservative style. And the moment she came in, Kiki started handing different items to look at. One of the first things she handed her was something called the Net Lady Stocking Spring Butterfly, which is that. And so they gave it to the Arusa, and she studied it, and then she passed it to the fiancé, and he studied it, and then they passed it to the mother, and the mother studied it, and then they passed it to the younger brother, who was like 16, and he studied it probably longer than anybody else. And they did this for more than an hour. And I stood there and watched, and they picked out a huge amount of things and paid the equivalent of $360. There's a lot of money in Upper Egypt. And like at one point, Kiki pulled out like a pink G-string, and she's like, "What do you think?" And the fiancé said, "Wallahi, wallahi, laziz," like, by God, it's beautiful. It was this, the scene was completely comfortable. This was the mother there, kind of laughing as they were negotiating the final price, and that's Chen Taimei, the wife of Lin Xianfei. And it was interesting because I couldn't imagine like even the most self-confident American woman wanting to shop for such things with her fiancé, her mother, and her brother. Not to mention 2 foreign merchants and a foreign journalist right there. But the mood was really, it was like very innocent. It didn't feel like it was really connected to sex in people's minds. That really wasn't what was up. It was a marriage tradition, and it was a celebration. And because of that, it wasn't really sensitive. And it was not supposed to be done alone. It was supposed to have an audience. The display was part of it. So this was really fascinating to me. And after scenes like this, I would talk to Kiki and the others and curious to get their insights of the customers, but they were just totally uninterested in talking about it. They didn't really care about the motivation, why people wanted this stuff. They didn't have a lot of ideas about it. It took a long time for me to kind of draw ideas out of them, and I had to observe a lot. I had to hang out in these shots. I was also struck by their total lack of preparation for the Egyptian culture. I never met any of these dealers who had studied Arabic. In fact, I never met one who even had a dictionary, an Arabic dictionary. None of them was well educated, and they learned the language just from work, just on the fly. I titled the story like "Learning to Speak Lingerie" because I described something that I call the lingerie dialect, which was Egyptian is very, it's an inflected language, which of course Chinese is not. Chinese does not have gender, and so this was not something that Chinese speakers would naturally think about. But in Egypt, you speak differently if you're a woman, if you're a man. But these guys, even the guys in the shops, picked up the feminine voice because that's who they were talking to, was women. And so they would say, I remember hearing one guy say, "Ana zale," and he was like playfully saying, "I'm angry." But he's saying it kind of like a woman would say it, which the Egyptians kind of found sort of funny, but also disarming. It was also interesting the things that they had very minimal things that they could talk about, but one of the things that they could do very early was make political jokes. Like the guy Yeda, who was in Malawi, the town that had the violence. One time I saw him negotiate with somebody, and somebody wanted to pay 25, and he said, "Oh no, that was the price under Morsi. But now it's Sisi, and Sisi says 30." And the Egyptian guy laughed, and it was very effective because Egyptians love they love jokes in general. They're very irreverent, and nothing in politics is sacred. But imagine in China if you're a beginning Chinese speaker and you start telling Xi Jinping jokes, right? I mean, it was an amazing contrast to sort of watch how. But also their instinct had taught them this. They figured it out. They knew very little about the religion. One of the Chinese actually asked me at one point, "The ones with the crosses, are they Muslim?" And another guy spoke of the women with headscarves as Muslim Jiao, while he talked the ones who wore the full coverings and the niqab as Arabs. He had a different word for them. And he thought there was a different religion, which was also interesting to me. Because like in a way, they didn't see Islam as monolithic. And his observation was somewhat reasonable. I mean, those groups of people actually did believe different things about faith and about culture. And I learned that, generally we had this assumption that when you're dealing in a business, especially with like a sensitive product, you want to be as knowledgeable as possible. This was actually the opposite. The fact that the Chinese knew so little made people very comfortable. They liked that. And so they always had an Egyptian assistant, always a woman, because their language was limited. And in this case, the woman was named Rahma Medhat. And she had worked with other Chinese before that. And one of the things she said to me is the Chinese keep their secrets. They're not connected to local gossip networks. And she said of the Chinese, she said, "I can't describe how they do it. They can look at an item and give it to a woman and that's it. An Egyptian would look at the item and then look at the woman and he might make a joke or laugh about it." And she said of her Chinese boss, "He doesn't have anything in mind while he's selling. When you buy something, you can feel the thoughts of the person selling it. And with the Chinese, their brains don't go thinking about women's bodies." So there was some different connection that people had, and it was very effective. And so they were, this was interesting to me. That they had positioned themselves in this kind of ingenious place, even though they really had no preparation and at some level not even a lot of interest in the culture. One thing that this made me think about over time is a sort of an early social scientist named Georg Simmel, kind of one of the first sociologists who sort of helped start to establish the field of sociology. My father was a sociologist. And Simmel wrote an influential essay in 1908 called "The Stranger." And the title refers, the stranger is somebody, an outsider who comes to a community, and the role that this kind of outsider can play. And he says that his position in this group is determined essentially by the fact that he has not belonged to it from the beginning, that he imparts qualities into it which do not and cannot stem from the group itself. And so the stranger can be somebody who has a different nationality, a different ethnicity, a different faith. Simmel came from an assimilated Jewish family. And in this essay, he described the European Jew as a classical example of the stranger, somebody who's in the community but not necessarily of the community. He also mentioned traders who might come into a business and into a community and sell things, migrant workers. And as he writes, sometimes people tell things to the stranger. They might unburden themselves to the stranger, things that they wouldn't tell their relatives, friends, or neighbors. The stranger is not radically committed to the unique ingredients and peculiar tendencies of the group, and therefore approaches them with a specific attitude of objectivity. But objectivity does not simply involve passivity and detachment. It is a particular structure composed of distance and nearness, indifference and involvement. I found that over the years, I often look for these figures as a writer. I sort of gravitate to them. In China, I often wrote about migrants because they had this perspective. They were out of place, and it made them observe things differently, gave them a different perspective. I wrote a long piece a number of years ago in part of a book about a Uyghur middleman, a trader who lived in Beijing, and he spoke Russian and Chinese, and so he would kind of help put business deals together. And he was a classic stranger figure. And of course, I also wrote in Cairo about a garbage man in my neighborhood. I lived in a fairly middle class and affluent section of central Cairo, and this guy would come in every day and pick up the garbage, but because it wasn't systematized, he had to collect from everybody individually and negotiate with them, so he got to know the people very well. And he went through the trash very carefully because everything was recycled. So he'd know everything that you threw away. And he was kind of a point of communication, I learned over time. He wasn't literate, but he was highly intelligent, and he was everywhere in the community, and people would get information from him. So he was a classic stranger character. So I often, as a journalist, I think these are really interesting people to keep an eye out for. And of course, as a journalist, you're kind of a stranger as well. This is the role. I think whether you're a foreigner or Chinese or anybody, this is often your role. You're not really part of the same community, and people sometimes will tell you things that they don't want to tell others. And it gives people a different perspective. When I was talking with Lean, they had their lingerie shop, but he had noticed while he was in Upper Egypt after a few years that there was a lot of plastic bottles and trash along the roads, which of course everybody had noticed. But he responded to this by saying, I think I can recycle this. So he went to Taizhou, and remember, this is a guy with a 5th grade education, and his wife was actually illiterate. She had never gone to school even for a day in China. And but he went to Taizhou and met with a guy who ran a recycling plant and bought this large assembly line, and brought a technician over, but also learned to handle the machinery himself and set up this operation, which became the first recycling plant in southern Egypt and became quite successful. But he wasn't trained to do this. And one of the early days, he was preparing one of the machines and had his hand in it, and a worker turned on the switch, and it pulled him in and broke his arm in 5 places, and dragged him in all the way. His face was scarred from it. He spent 20 days in the hospital in Asyut. And remember, this is the place where 你是自己最好的医生, where you are your own best doctor. Not a place where you want to get skin grafts and everything else, but he had to do it there. But then once he got out, he was back at work. So these were very tough people. And it was interesting. To me, there are a couple things that were striking. Was first of all that all of the aid that had been going to Egypt for all the years, all this development, nobody had ever done this business. This was like a business that needed to be done. And it was not only was it profitable, and it employed about 30 people, and other people were picking up bottles of bringing, but of course it was environmentally good. But it took this guy with a 5th grade education and a wife who had never worked, who had never been to school, to get it started. He, like most people I met, he didn't say much about, he didn't have strong political ideas. But I asked him once, what's the biggest problem in Egypt? And he said, he surprised me. This is one of the few times where he spoke very forcefully about a political idea. He said, or cultural idea. He said, inequality between men and women. Here the women just stay home. If they want to develop, the first thing they need to do is solve this problem. That's what China did after the revolution. It's a waste of talent here. Look at my family. You see how my wife works. We wouldn't have the factory without her, and my daughter runs the shop. If they were Egyptian, they wouldn't be doing this. So this was, it helped me see Egypt in a different way. It was also an interesting project for me because it was really a contrast in cultures, but not a clash in cultures. I think often when the Chinese are involved in Africa, you see these clash elements and there's tensions. That wasn't the case in Egypt, partly because they weren't involved in resource extraction or sort of big scale projects. It was this very personal human thing. And I noticed that they spoke very positively about each other, actually. The Egyptians admired how hard the Chinese worked, although they always said, oh, his wife bosses him around. And the Chinese would say, oh, the Egyptians, they don't like to work, they're lazy. Sometimes they would say that, but they all said, but they're incredibly friendly and they will help you if you're in trouble. If your car breaks down on the highway, people will stop immediately. That would never happen in China. So they sort of appreciated some of these contrasts, some of these differences. I think I want to make sure that we have time for questions. So I want to stop here and open up the floor to anybody who has anything about this or anything else.
Thanks for coming to Duke. This is wonderful. I read The Buried last year and really found it terrific. And I guess I'm kind of wondering whether what was happening for you as you were meeting these Chinese entrepreneurs and merchants was that it kind of felt to me like you were becoming somewhat frustrated and discouraged by watching the deterioration of the Arab Spring. And that in a way, this was kind of a serendipity to kind of connect with this community a little bit. And that maybe did it feel like you were able to find some familiarity and find some connection to things, people you knew? And I think I'm kind of packaging two questions together on this. Did you envy their ability to kind of, unlike you, come into this culture and not feel they had to ask questions, not have to know everything that's going on, not having to do the level of research and careful knowledge? And then the second question, which you can answer or not, is I would love to know what your wife's version of that couple of years was like. I don't know if she wants to write on it.
Yeah, no, those are good questions. Yeah, so, I mean, it was, of course, when I first arrived in Egypt, I did know that eventually I probably would look at whatever Chinese were doing, but I deliberately did not want to start by doing that. So actually our first couple years in Egypt, I never pursued anything related to China. And it was really just by chance that this happened. The timing was fortuitous in the sense that it was a dark moment and a hard time. And this was nice to see a different kind of connection and a different kind of insight. Leslie's project is definitely, there's a lot of overlaps in the sense. So Leslie's book, which comes out in actually March 8th on International Women's Day, she's looking at women entrepreneurs and factory workers in Egypt. So kind of like an in-depth look at what this is like from the Egyptian. A lot of these issues like the gehez and the dowry is a big part of what she's writing about. And really one of these issues is manufacturing in some ways, right? I mean, you look at China and the manufacturing, was more than 30% of the economy for 30 years. This is massive. In Egypt right now, with a very weak GDP, it's 15%. And it's pretty much always been at that level for 60 years. It's never been high. And this is, a young, populous country. And you really notice, so you think about it first in economic terms, but you also notice culturally. Like one of the things when Leslie wrote about factory workers and I wrote about factory people in Zhejiang and other places was the ways in which they were institutionalized, right? You come to the city, you're from the farm, and you're in a factory. You learn to live by the clock. You learn to follow rules. You learn protocols. You become a city person. And Egypt's also had a lot of migration to Cairo. Over the years, and people often would say, they turn Cairo, the villagers come to Cairo and they turn it into a village. Because most people work in the informal economy. They're not in institutions, and so they're not being turned into city people. They turn the city into a village. And 2/3 of Greater Cairo is in what they call ashwayet, which is like informal areas.
Like
that
garbage man's.
The garbage man lived in a place like that. And so his mother was a twin. She had identical twin sisters. And I visited her sister who was still in the village. And the mother had left and gone to Cairo 40 years earlier. And the sister stayed in the village. And they were exactly the same. They dressed the same. They had the same religious views, very similar economics, the same ideas. Neither was devout. They were both devout. And that to me was amazing. Like in China, if you had twins and one went and migrated and the other stayed in the village, it would be a complete contrast. And many of us know families like that, where one kid, got out earlier and the life was totally different. And that to me was powerful, kind of seeing that in Egypt. And
Thank you very much. And when I asked that question about your wife, I didn't realize she'd actually was
oh yeah,
coming out with
it's taken her a while, but it's a really good book. Yeah, I just finished going through it with her, and it's been a long project, but I think it's really such an important subject, and she could go into it with a depth that I couldn't really. I mean, I was kind of seeing another side of it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Great.
Thank you for coming out to campus. One of my questions was, you touched on how these Chinese immigrants all scattered and kind of avoided contact with one another and established their own territories. And I think that's a really interesting contrast to what we see with immigrant communities, at least in a U.S. context over the past 200 years. In all these waves of immigration, everyone seeks out each other and build these communities where they can lean on one another. So and you see that with Chinese Americans in America too. So that leads me to assume that it's not because of the Chinese immigrants, but maybe because of the destination. So I was wondering what the root cause of that might be, and also how they dealt with that lack of society and community to lean on.
Yeah, I mean, they definitely built networks, so they knew the other Chinese all over the place, but they were not in clusters. They were very isolated. I mean, these were just a lot of, how did they deal with the isolation? I mean, I guess Zhongyang Dianshitai, they would watch a lot of CCTV. It was always on all the time. But they're just tough, They could deal with the isolation. It wasn't something, they didn't do it for enjoyment, and they were always planning to leave. And actually, I just talked with Liu Jun the other day because I kind of wanted to update, and they went back to China after the currency collapse in 2016, and Lin and Chen, the mother, just left last year. So they kept the recycling company until just last year. But that was always the plan, to make money and then retire back in China. But yeah, they could deal with intense isolation, basically. Yeah.
Thank you for your brilliant, I would say, in ethnography observation of the different cultural contexts and the stories in both Egypt and China. I noticed that you take a lot of photos in your journey to both Egypt and China. So I'm gonna ask a question about more like a methodology of your perceptions and observation. Taking photos and communicating with the interlocutors and writing down something are three totally different perspectives of observing and preserving in another cultural context. I'm really interested in, could you please describe your experience or the feelings of using these three totally different methodologies to narrate these stories and perceive?
Photography, the note take, what?
Photography and communicating and writing down something.
Yeah, the photography, I mean, I'm not actually, this is a professional picture. So this was done by a photographer who came down after I reported the story. The pictures that are really clear. So I usually just kind of take reference pictures. And it's a very different way of interfacing with people. So I try to be careful. Like when I talked about the Arusa who was shopping, I didn't take pictures until kind of the end. I took that one picture that had her mother because I knew that would probably disrupt things. I didn't want to get a camera out. So I tend to be quite careful, but I try to take pictures of things that I want to remember. It helps me for notes, basically. It also is nice to illustrate things, if you talk about it later, but it's different and it's never my focus. The photography is always just something that I'll do if I get a chance, if it's not disruptive. Yeah, of course, talking to people, but I mean, I'm always taking notes, when I'm in a situation like this. I always have a notebook and I'm constantly writing down. And I think that's also important to remind people that that's what I do. I am recording things. Of course, they know I'm a journalist, but just to remind them of that. But yeah, thanks.
Hi, Mr. Hessler. Thank you so much for being here. I have a question regarding you talked about during the presentation that during the that after the incident, the governor blamed the West, the U.S., for meddling in their own internal affairs, and you see that similar rhetorics currently in China. And there have been incidents where Western reporters, when I think probably the situation has changed, that Western reporters, when the Chinese people see them, sometimes, I think nowadays especially, you see this rise of nationalism and hostility that they're saying that they thought the Western reporters, like mostly white guys, they kind of trying to sort of create their own sort of narratives. And how do you think, as journalists and Western journalists, how should people navigate through this sort of a rising hostility? And have you also observed that in Egypt? Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's very hard in China. I mean, the main issue in China is that American journalists can't get in, really. They can't get visas. And so we have very few Americans on the ground who are reporting there. And so the access is, people are having to report on China from Korea and from Taiwan, and so by remote, it's impossible to do this, obviously. It really is a problem. So it's a big issue. I was in China 2019 to 2021, so sort of during the outbreak of COVID. I was surprised that I didn't encounter this problem much, actually. I found it not too hard to report. And I didn't have, occasionally you'd have conversations with people who were angry at the US, but it didn't dominate at all. But yeah, this is always an issue. And in Egypt, it was a significant issue because of, there were a lot of protests that were violent. And that was another reason why it was important to learn good enough Arabic to be able to kind of diffuse the situation, explain who you were, put people at ease. They always feel better if you're talking to them in their language. And again, not having all these people around you sometimes is better. They're not really going to protect you. They may just draw more attention.
Thank you again for this wonderful, and the pictures were a great addition to what I had read earlier. But I was wondering about, if you'd done a symmetrical kind of work in China, especially with African traders who seem to be going out a lot to places like Yiwu or in Guangzhou or wherever. Have you written anything about that?
No, when I first went to China, I thought that maybe I did spend time in Yiwu, and I had thought that at some point I might look into the Middle Eastern traders, but we left too early. We left unexpectedly after 2 years. So I never got into it, actually. But my student Edie is working on it. One of my students from Chengdu is here now. Actually, I think she's one of the reasons that I was invited here. But Edie is researching African traders in China. So I think it is these links are really interesting and very promising. And again, those are strangers. The stranger, the figure, the same figure. They will have different insights on what happens in China, what it's like for them. And so I think this kind of work is really important as we think about, the contacts and communications between different cultures in different parts of the world. Yeah.
Does anybody else have any more? Any questions? Such a rich talk. Okay. Did you want to say no? Okay. Well, then I think we'll just give you the final applause.
Thank you.